unlike the Dutch, who had a harder time having people come onto New Jersey lands, the British had no problem at having people come in and just push the Lenni Lenape west. It was said that some of the first settlers of Monmouth County were Richard Stout and John Bound from the Gravesend area in Long Island, who would later be some of the patenters for the Monmouth patent and settled in what is now contemporary Middletown. As for the Monmouth patent, it should be noted that many of the men already knew each other from Gravesend and decided to come down following Bound and Stout in order to gain new lands for themselves and their families to live in prosperity. Didn't really seem to matter, though it wasn't their prosperity to live on. The Monmouth patent was signed over 3 different deeds covering from January to April 8, 1665. The men who had the land patented to them were William Goulding, Samuel Spicer, Richard Gibbons, Richard Stout, James Grover, John Bound, John Tilton, Nathaniel Sylvester, William Reed, Walter Clark, Nichols Davis, and Obadiah Holmes. They were obliged by the patent that within 3 years they had to have 100 families on the property. This, of course, led to differing families being brought onto the land, which in effect took up a lot of Lenni Lenape land. What was probably most interesting was that 7 out of the 12 patenters for the Monmouth patent did not come to the bought land at all, rather sending their family or children to live upon the land. This really goes to show how it only had to do with money, and that the fact that the Lenni Lenape lived here and they loved this land didn't matter to them at all. I would now like to bring up the controversy that did come up with the Monmouth patent. A year before the patent was established, the land line between the Hudson River and the Delaware River was supposed to be given to a Lord Berkeley and Sir George Carteret. The brother of Sir George Carteret, Philip Carteret, at once hearing about the patent, proclaimed that he was the governor of this land and that the settlers had to take out new patents under his proprietors, who would be landlords, that they had to pay quick rents to. Chaos was soon to occur with many changes in ownership to follow. The reason I point this out specifically is that if Richard Hartshorn heard about all this controversy surrounding the Monmouth patent, and in 20 years after the patent was originally established, he and several others took up the area between Wreck Pond and contemporary Spring Lake to Barnegat Bay. The land was taken under the name of the Manasquan Beach Company. Why they called it the Manasquan Beach Company? Well, as a part of the letter they sent to the governor of East New Jersey, since New Jersey was divided into East and West at the time, they pointed out they wanted to purchase the Indian right to what the Native Americans called Manasquan. Under the authority of the governor, the Indian right and title of the land known as Place to Gather Reed and Grass was taken from the natives. Some patents had already been planted on the land they wanted to use, and the tier of lots that they bought up were called Squan lots, which could explain why the town at first was called Squan Village. The last Lenape to have claims of the lands of Manasquan were Tom Storm and Andrew Woolley. They claimed to own all the land from the mouth of Squan River to the mouth of Shrewsbury, by the streams of each their heads, and across from one head to another. At the conference at Crosswicks, Pennsylvania, in February of 1758, and their claim was settled in at a conference at Easton, Pennsylvania, within the same year. Before I go into it, though, I have to go into the background which led to the total downfall of Lenapehoking. I have to go into the creation of the Brotherton Reservation. Members of the Religious Society of Friends, also known as the Quakers, were some of the most prominent early English settlers. As the number of English exploded, the number of Native Americans decreased due to sicknesses such as smallpox and the abuse of alcohol. By the year 1745, the population of Lenni Lenape was 1/10 what it originally was before the Europeans invaded. I'll bring you now to the start of what would be known as the Brotherton Reservation, and to do so, we will start at Crosswicks in Pennsylvania. Crosswicks, which used to be known as Croxweeksung, meant divided waters or place of separation by the Lenni Lenape, because at this point, many of the people were forced onto this land, having been pushed out of their homes. Of course, because this was a community of unmoderated Indians, someone had to be brought in to watch over them and Christianize them. However, Reverend David Brainerd, who was the missionary for Crosswicks, was not a harsh man at all, and in fact kept the white settlers in the surrounding area from antagonizing the Native Americans. However, the crops soon began to fail in these lands, and they had to find somewhere else to go. They ended up moving into the lands close to Cranberry, and there established a community known as Bethel. David soon died of tuberculosis, and his brother, John, came in to take his place. Despite the fact that John Brainerd put in a lot of effort into the area, just like his brother, the Native Americans were eventually sued by the Chief Justice of New Jersey, Robert Hunter Morris. He claimed the title of the land under the pretext of a will made by the Indian's former king that was undoubtedly forged. In his attempts to remove the Indians from the land they were living on, the lands they were forced onto, he was very uncaring and vicious to the fact that this group of Native Americans had nowhere else to go. I think that what was so despicable about the act is that he was suing the Native Americans for having false claims over the land. He was a shrewd land speculator that made patents from this land for himself and his buddies. These patents were produced to predate the establishment of Bethel, which of course was not at all true. He just sued the Native Americans for having false claims over the land, and then produced false claims for himself and his buddies. The Indians were required to leave their homes in 1755, and as much as John Brainerd tried to keep them all together, they ended up just scattering. Some returned to the unfertile lands of Crosswicks, others stayed in the wilderness close to Bethel. These natives of once was the Bethel area sent a petition to the royal governor, Jonathan Belcher, pleading with him that they had nowhere else to go and they were stuck between the conflicting forces of the English and the Lenape taking the French side in the French and Indian War. There was the first meeting held in Crosswicks, which was a meeting between the Lenape and the commissioners for the New Jersey General Assembly, where general things were discussed in order to improve the lives of these Bethel Indians. It was, however, at the second meeting that Tom Storm and Andrew Rowley, who I mentioned before, came in, along with the Indians from tribes in all the surrounding area. This was a meeting about the claims that the Lenape from all parts of northern New Jersey and some parts of New York and Pennsylvania had about settlers on their land. It'd be later at a conference known as Easton that it would be decided that a tract of land would be given to all of the Delaware Indians, also known as the Algonquin Indians, that lived south of the Riverton River. It was then that the Lenape had to give up their rights to all the lands of New Jersey except for the assigned tract of land that the settlers, these invaders, were going to give them. The lands that they were given were known as Edgepolick, meaning place of pure clean water, which existed in what is now contemporary Burlington County. This land will be the first in the newly conquered lands by the Europeans, the first Native American reservation on United States soil. The Brotherton Reservation. The land was described as composing of cedar swamp and a sawmill attached to thousands of acres of poor, uninhabited land that were only good for hunting and fishing because of its proximity to the coast. There were about 200 natives that gathered onto this land, which, like before at Bethel, was being supervised by John Brainerd. Brainerd honestly had high hopes for the reservation. He worked hard on it. He worked with the Native Americans in order to make it work. He helped them set up the grist and sawmills that existed on the land, pushed them to work with the new technology. It worked for a time. The settlers eventually started to call the Brotherton Reservation, nicknaming it as the Indian Mills. It was obviously Brainerd who was helping keep things afloat, though, because when he left the reservation to go die of illness, everything simply went to the dogs. An upstate New York tribe known as the Oneida, a section of the Algonquin or Delaware Nation that was somehow still alive, decided to open up their lands for the failing reservation. In 1801, only fewer than 85 Native Americans out of the 200 that had came into Brotherton left the reservation after the New Jersey Assembly agreed to just sell the reservation and just let the Lenape leave New Jersey. Prior to even the founding of the Brotherton, many of the Lenape just fled west, some as far as up into Canada. So out of the minuscule number still left in New Jersey, the last chief of the Brotherton, Elijah Ahatena, also known as Lashar Tamar, left with the natives that agreed to go. Others stayed in New Jersey and assimilated. The Brotherton Indians stayed with the Oneida until 1832, when they asked the New Jersey legislature for the money gained from the selling of the reservation before leaving again. The remaining 40 members of the tribe moved to Statesburg, Wisconsin. Later, even some more of the tribe broke off and moved in to join the Cherokees and the Osages west of the Mississippi. Some later went to the Indian Territory of Oklahoma. This can be seen as officially the ending of the overall Lenni Lenape presence in New Jersey and the total takeover and dissolving of Lenapehoking. I would like now to bring up the fact that the Lenni Lenape were like a family. The society existed with both its good and bad parts to it, just like every other society. They were a friendly people that prior to European colonization were only pulled into conflicts by their neighboring nations. The reason that they only joined the French and Indian War had to do with the sad fact that they had to decide who was going to rule them better, the English or the French, and they had to make a decision. They did their best to avoid the unavoidable, tried to solve problems instead of using violence, collaboration instead of fighting. Now, I just want you all to know I love my school. Everything about it, from the staff to the students, everybody there is so nice. But the one thing that I can't stand is having to walk through the hallways and seeing our school mascot, wearing the long headdress that only can be associated with the chief of a Sioux Nation tribe. This is the kind of headdress you would see on a chief Lakota Indian, for example. And unless our school mascot is supposed to be a Sioux Indian, which would make no sense, I wonder why nobody bothered to be politically correct when making our school mascot. Lenape clothing is very unique to the area, very unique to the climate that we live in. The Lenape women wore knee-length skirts while the Lenape men wore breechcloths or leggings. Due to the hot summer conditions, they never really wore shirts, maybe a deerskin mantle when it got cold. Both genders of Lenape wore earrings and shirts, and deerskin moccasins on their feet. It was only until the European invaders came that some of the Lenape started to restyle themselves to wear cloth blouses and jackets, but decorating them with fancy beads. The men of the clan would get tattoos in the design of animals, and they would paint their faces in certain colors and designs that depended on the occasion. And because of this, many Lenape men wore their faces hairless. The Lenape women wore their hair in braids, while the men often wore a mohawk hairstyle or shaved head with a scalp lock in the middle. Most importantly, their headdress was a beaded headband that had 1 or 2 feathers sticking out of it. Sometimes the chief of the clan would wear a headdress made of many feathers, but all of them would be standing up. The headband was finger woven or was a deerskin strip with beads and tribal designs on it. When the headband was tied around the head was when the 1 or 2 feathers would be stuck in it. They used hawk, turkey, egret, and eagle feathers for the job. Unlike the many headdresses that existed in many different Native American nations across what is now the United States, the headdress was not associated for war, but simply for its beauty. The number and type of feather did not matter, and they often decorated their headbands with very detailed patterns, wampum, beads, and quill work. In current times, what is left of the Lenape only wear feathers in their hair on special occasions, like a dance. Which brings me now to the fact, as I'm ending my speech, that the Lenni Lenape tribe has absolutely no representation in this town. There should be something, a monument, something to recognize the fact that we acknowledge that they were actually here, that they were a part of this land. Because I look around this town and I see absolutely nothing like they never were even here. They're completely absent from this land. The land that they once called home. If you did not catch it before, I slipped the meaning of Manasquan in when I was talking about the founding of Manasquan. It is called place to gather, reed, and grass, which is not even remotely close to the definition of the island of squaws given on the Manasquan website. I also found with it 7 other definitions, which definitely tells you that nobody even bothered to find one definite definition. And you know how I found my definition? I asked. All I did was ask. I emailed the Delaware Nation asking, what is the definition of Manasquan? It took them less than a day to get back to me saying, the definition of Manasquan is place to gather reeds and grass. You'll find a lot of what I talked about today had to do with an ending rather than a start. I just really wanted to emphasize today, if anything, how important the Lenape were to this land before it was taken over. Without them being